although we are a law enforcement agency, I think our critically important role at the CCC is actually one of corruption prevention. And part of that involves these sorts of presentations where we hope at least this performs an educated role, similarly to the way that Nicola does when she does these tours as well. So the message really is that there are things that you need to know to recognise as corruption risks and put in place things to mitigate the risk and deal with it, rather than once it occurs, coming to us or the police and leaving it to us to clean the mess up, whether it be a criminal charge, a dismissible disciplinary breach, or something as serious as that. It's far more sustainable to identify and prevent that sort of misbehaviour rather than let it get out of control. And it makes perfect sense when you think about it from a economically sustainable viewpoint. The second thing I need to say is that what I'm going to be talking about community expectations and giving examples of what they are and how they might be breached, I'm talking at a very high level. You shouldn't think that I'm talking about any individual or any group of individuals, or in particular any council. You'd understand from the media in recent times that there's been a lot of activity in the local government sector. There's been some serious alleged corrupt conduct that we've uncovered. Criminal charges have been laid, and those investigations into various councils is ongoing. I'm not talking about that. What I'm referring to is generalities. I'm going to talk about examples, not naming people or councils or any individuals, as I say. And you shouldn't draw those conclusions. People are before the court. Our job in that sense is done. What the court does with it, what a jury might do with it, a magistrate might do with those cases, is largely irrelevant to us, other than being curious about the end result of work that we've carried out. But that's the advantage, if you like, and the necessary framework that centres around a separation from the investigator, which the CCC falls into as a category, and the judicial arm, which decides those issues quite independently. We decide to charge someone, we put them before the court. If it's indictable, the Director of Public Prosecutions has control of it and prosecutes it. If he or she thinks that there is no reasonable prospect of success, or the evidence is insufficient, and in effect disagrees with our assessment, that's their call, not ours. So we have no control over that. We might be consulted for as a courtesy, but we have no decision-making role in that process. And that's exactly how it should be. There's got to be a separation between the policeman and the prosecutor. So bear all that in mind, and bear that in mind when you're asking me questions. I can't talk about individual cases. Not because I'm being sneaky about it or trying to maintain secrecy, it's just the process. It'd be quite unfair of me to start talking about individual cases before the court, because that's not our function. It's not your function unless you end up on the jury at some point. So we need to stay away from that, so we make sure that those people, whatever they've done or haven't done, get a fair trial, and the result is fair to them and you, the community, and us as the investigators. So the first thing I want to do is talk about this. I'm introducing this presentation with this slide for this reason. It's important to understand in local government that local governments, that's the councils, are charged with the good rule and local government of their area. In your case, that's the Redlands area. The local government, and that's in the Constitution of Queensland Act itself, as we say there in Section 7. The Local Government Act of 2009 makes it clear that each council, as a body politic, as an entity, is the elected body responsible for the good rule and government of their local area. And that, as you see, is Section 8 of that Act. By Section 12, sub 3, sub D of the same Act, all councillors are responsible for being accountable to the community. the local government's performance. Now that has some significance, because it's not a case where, as a member of the council, you can say, oh look, I didn't know that my fellow councillor was misbehaving. I had no idea that he or she were up to that sort of conduct. So it's not my fault. I'm completely innocent. I've done nothing wrong. You have individually and collectively responsibility as councillors to promote the values of transparency, accountability and good governance across the organisation, which in the case we're talking about is the council. And if you think about that for a moment, if each councillor has that responsibility globally and takes it seriously, corruption and misconduct cannot thrive, cannot continue. Because ultimately it will be discovered, it will be found out, it will be called out, reported and dealt with if it's not noticed as soon as it happens. Now that's the foundation, the fundamental plank in this whole local government sector. Starts with the Constitution, it's reinforced by the Local Government Act itself, and at the end of the day, the Minister and the Department also have responsibility to make sure that there is ongoing public confidence in the local government sector as a whole. If there's a failure of public confidence, for whatever reason, it doesn't matter why, there's a failure of public confidence, it has to be addressed. Because you, as the community, who exercise your democratic right to vote in individual councillors to represent you, you place your trust in them to do the job for you and look after you as individuals and as a community. They have an ongoing responsibility to maintain that and to maintain your confidence and trust in them. Now, if for whatever reason that fails, that is a significant failure in transparency, accountability and good governance, which has to be addressed. So what is, can we tell the core of what this is all about, what is, or what do we think are the community expectations of elected representatives? What do you expect the people you vote in to represent you in your local councils? I'm going to go through these individually shortly in the coming slides, but this is a summary of them. Power and influence you expect will not be improperly used for personal benefit or the benefit or detriment of another. So you'd be expecting your councillors, people you've placed your trust in, to always exercise the power that they have in that role, and it's considerable, as you know, under the Local Government Act. You'd expect them to always exercise that power in the public interest. And as Dr. Stepanov said, the last thing you'd be expecting or wanting will be for them to act in their own interests, potentially, almost inevitably, to the detriment of your interests as the people who voted them in, or have them acting to the detriment of someone else for a personal reason, not connected with the public interest. Now these things are, we know, obvious, but I can assure you this sort of misbehaviour goes on. I'm not talking about individuals now, I can tell you all of these things I'm talking about are evidence-based, and you wouldn't be surprised to hear them, I'm sure. This sort of misbehaviour occurs. People do breach the trust that you place in them as, and again I'll say you, not talking about this community, you in a general sense of voters, people do breach that trust in these ways. There should obviously be oversight, appropriate oversight and accountability for expenditure and use of public resources. That's what you'd expect. If you're going to be spending rate-paid, your money, you'd expect there to be proper oversight and accountability of that process. You'd expect that there to be the relationship between council and councillors and the private sector, in particular, property developers and other recipients of council contracts, to be professional, appropriate and suitably monitored, so that everyone can understand transparently that it is an appropriate professional relationship. that there's no personal favour being done, there's no greasing of the wheels, there's no facilitation of a development application for a undisclosed personal gift or benefit. Again, those things happen. You wouldn't be surprised to hear. Next, steps that have to be taken to ensure transparency of council action and decision making. And any mechanism that's identified that seems to be designed to avoid scrutiny must be reported and dealt with. I'll come to examples of how that might happen, but what you need to know is that the actions of your councillors and council collectively will withstand scrutiny. That what they do is transparently in your interests, public interest more generally, and not for some other nefarious, personal, private motive. And you need to be able to determine that openly. And there shouldn't be any attempt to hide the way they operate from you, because you need to know, to have confidence in them as your councillors. So councillors themselves, executive officers and staff of the council must be encouraged to report observed or suspected corrupt conduct or misconduct. And those who do report have to be encouraged to do so and protected against reprisal action that might be taken for having disclosed misconduct. You know, there is the Public Interest Disclosure Act, used to be called the Whistleblowers Protection Act years ago, and people still refer to people who report misconduct and corrupt conduct as whistleblowers. They're now, under the new Act, Public Interest Disclosures. The principles are the same, you understand the concept. And there's a whole regime in there, firstly to properly identify who is a PID, Public Interest Disclosure, or whistleblower, and if they are properly categorised in that way, how they should be protected. And I can tell you, and it wouldn't be a surprise to you, that's a highly controversial and problematic area. In your community here, you're a reasonably large community, although it's small enough that where you can understand what most people in your community are up to. You either know them or know of them, perhaps. The smaller the community, the harder it is to protect people who might be reporting misconduct, because everyone can work out who it is. So you might think, look, I'm terrified of reporting it, because if I do, I'm going to lose my job, or at the very least I'll be subject to bullying, harassment, denigration, and ultimately some form of reprisal action. You can understand this is a particular problem you would be surprised to hear in the Indigenous remote communities that I visit regularly, because they have an extended meaning for what to a family, that they're so small, those communities, and so isolated, everyone does know everyone and everyone's business. So if something is happening and needs to be reported, and the person wants to report it anonymously and have it dealt with and get protection, it is almost impossible to achieve that. That's not the fault of the person who wants to report it. They're doing exactly the right thing. It's our fault as a community for not devising a way that they can be properly protected. But it is a problem in all communities, but the smaller ones have that particular aspect to it that is problematic. But there has to be a culture, as you just heard, of encouragement to report misbehaviour, corrupt conduct, and protection of those people. And of course, the last point here is again the obvious one. You need to have in place an internal, you'd expect to have in place an internal, robust audit process. So you have someone within the council, internal auditor, whose job it is to run his or her eye over all of the things go on in council to see whether there are things that should be tidied up. Are they mistakes? Is it an example of corruption or misconduct, or just a simple mistake? If it's the latter, how might it be corrected? If it's the former, it should be reported up the line and ultimately perhaps to us or the police and dealt with. And how can the internal audit process be strengthened to make sure that that is identified more readily next time if it happens? So you might get the idea that all of these things are obviously things you would expect to have going on as a reasonable, fundamentally appropriate standard of conduct for your elected representatives. I'll take you to the first one, power and influence. One of the things you might think is necessary here is a training for staff so they know when they're subject to improper or inappropriate influence. Now, one of the examples I quote here, again, it's a generic high-level example, but it's an obvious one when you think about it. There was evidence to our Belcara inquiry that looked into the conduct and behaviour that took place in respect of the last council elections in 2016, in respect of those 4 councils, Ipswich, Moreton Bay, Gold Coast and Logan. And there was evidence there, I'm not sure what happens at Redlands, but in those evidence for those councils that almost always, well, by far the greater majority, was over 90%, might have been 98, someone said 99%, of development applications are not decided by councillors. And the evidence was given to say, well, look, there's nothing to see here, the councillors have nothing to do with it. So we can't be corrupted. We don't do those decisions. What it doesn't take into account is this. The councillor, who might have an interest, might have a friendly developer who's been fobbing him or her, there is a committee that makes the decision of staff members, not councillors at all, as we heard in the Belcara hearing. The councillor who's got that interest and connection to the developer goes in to see the staff members, perhaps separately, perhaps collectively, but the purpose is to exert influence. To go and say, listen, we know that you have to make the decision independently. We're not trying to take away that right of yours. That's your job. We know you'll do it well and independently of us. But I can just tell you, Bob's a great bloke. He's got the interests of your community, our council area at heart. Now, as I say, I know you'll do your job, and I know you'll do what's best for the council and the council area. I can assure you, he's up for it, Bob. He knows what's right for this area. And then, having said that, they breeze off with a smile on the way, leaving it to them, the staff members, to make that all-important decision. Now, believe it or not, some of those staff members, there's a number of aspects to this. They might not realise there's been an attempt to improperly influence them. They might think, well, that's just a friendly conversation. And after all, the councillor did tell us it's our job, not theirs. So he's reinforcing the independence of this process. But at the end of the day, that is an improper attempt to influence. And you need to have staff trained to state the obvious and understand that that is an improper attempt. And if an attempt like that is made, they need to call it out. And be encouraged to do so, and if they do, be protected in doing so. I know that sounds fairly obvious and fairly basic, but believe me, the other side of the coin is employees, staff members, who are simply too afraid to go against someone who makes that attempt. They get the message loud and clear. The subtext is, you better do what I'm suggesting you should do, or your life here might be short-lived, and if it's not, it'll be unpleasant. That's the subtext. We all know that. So they have to be told explicitly in their training, in their induction perhaps, as early as that they should look out for those sort of things. Don't just accept that the councillor's doing the right thing and not misbehaving.